Hey guys, once again, here's chapter 11 on violent crime, and I promised to do my best to keep it below 10 minutes, so I'm going to talk as fast as I can. So here we go, let's get started. All right, seriously, we're talking about violence and violent crime. When you think back, when was the first time that you were exposed to violence? There is violence everywhere in our world, from movies to TV to games. But let's look at this clip real quick and see what we see in Disney. Well, I actually think that's enough. It's amazing when you look at it that way. The one that I disliked the most was The Lion King. I can remember taking my son to that when he was young and looking over at my husband like, oh my gosh, can you believe this? My little 5-year-old son crying his eyes out. But anyway, so we're exposed to violence in all aspects of our life. And the fear of crime comes from that exposure, but it is usually focused on the more obvious violent crimes of murder, rape, robbery, assault, etc. And crimes that are labeled as violent, they vary by ideology, time, location, observer, state, federal, the codes. Typically, according to your book, the definition of homicide is the unlawful killing of one human being by another. And we know there's no statute of limitations to homicide. I wanted to quickly show you too where I found the definition for state of Tennessee. So here's the definition according to the Criminal Code of Tennessee, Chapter 13. It's a premeditated and intentional killing of another. A killing of another committed in the perpetration or attempt to perpetrate any first-degree murder, terrorism, arson, rape, robbery, burglary, theft, kidnapping, aggravated child abuse, aggravated child neglect, rape of a child, aggravated rape of a child, or aircraft piracy, or a killing of another committed as the result of an unlawful throwing, placing, or discharging of a destructive device or bomb. Pretty sure this part 3 has been added more recently. But you can check this out on the Tennessee.gov site if you want to read more. And I'm sure as you learned in criminal law, for those of you that have had it, is that it doesn't necessarily involve an action, but it's the causal factor. It also can be an omission. But there's different categories of homicide: murder, manslaughter, excusable, and justifiable. The South has the highest rate of murder in the country. And you can review the lifetime death risk on your own, but you can see that murder is pretty high risk, and airplane crash the lowest. It's interesting. I just read a research study on pedestrians and the risk of pedestrians being hit and murdered either by a car, a drunk driver, has gone up recently. Homicide rates are considered the most accurate measure of crime, and the reason is obvious. But if you'll look, in 1980 we had a very high rate of homicides. In 1991 it dropped, and again in 2013 it dropped. But I want to show you something from the UCR. And we saw on that slide that in 2013 the homicide rate decreased. But if you look at the crime trends for 2014 and 15, you can see that violent crime has gone up 3.7%, where murder and homicide and manslaughter have gone up 11.8%. And so it's really more accurate to look at these that are current. They even have 2016 up. They've just started it. But I think the presentation said in 2012 it was 12,000, I'm sorry, 14,000 and something. So it went down in 2014, but then again it's up in 2015. And some interesting trends that we see is that more than 50% of the offenders had a prior arrest, those that have committed murder. And we already know that most murders are committed by someone you know. And men are most often killed on the street or in the kitchen with a knife. I think that's interesting. And women are likely to be killed in the home, specifically the bedroom, because it's either by a stranger, that's obvious. It's usually included in with a rape, but since women and men are mostly killed by people they know, women are usually killed by a significant other. And gun is the most common weapon of homicide in this country. And everybody in this class, I think except for the new student, was in the serial murder class, so this information should look very familiar. Serial killers commit repeat murders over a period of time. Remember we talked about that definition, that it's changed recently, that it has to be at least 2 murders over a period of time with a cooling off period. It counts for only 0.4% of the homicide rate. And as we know, victims are usually those throwaways that the society considers as throwaways, runaways, homeless, drifters. We talked about spree killers. Isn't that interesting that this book has spree killers when we know, class, right? Spree killers are no longer, it's no longer considered an acceptable term by the FBI. So we know that's now mass killers. So if we move to mass murderers, it's killing multiple victims in a single episode with no cooling off period. Even, and we talked about this before, that can occur even over a day or even 2 days, right? It just means they don't stop. It's not like the serial that kills and may go years, months, days before killing again. Mass murders have fewer victims than serial killers, and that is why, because it occurs at one time, and usually the mass killer turns the gun on themselves. It's resolved by suicide or apprehension because it's such a newsworthy event right at that time, right? It's hard to go in and start shooting at a McDonald's and it not hit the news and police respond. Likely to be a white, older than average, with a military background. Not so sure. Remember, it's not. I don't think that's likely, but many do have a military background because they had that military experience. But this can be misleading because, as we saw in serial killer class, just because they have a military background doesn't mean they were a successful soldier. They were probably kicked out for one reason or another. And 2 of the most recent cases, the Sandy Hook shooting with Adam Lanza, where he killed 20 children, 6 adults, and then killed himself. And then Aurora, Colorado, James Home, where he killed 12 people in the movie theater, and he did not kill himself. And we watched a really good movie on Adam Lanza that I wanted to use in this class as well. But I hate for it to be a repeat. But since you did watch it in the serial killer class, we'll decide that. And now we're moving into the purpose of looking at the homicide in criminology. Criminology, our purpose is to explain why crime happens, why this behavior occurs. And so when we look at offenders of homicide, are they just evil? Are they sick? Is it an immoral act at the core? Are they a born criminal? Are they born evil? Do they just snap? Some theorists suggest that the high rate of murder in the U.S. reflects the availability of guns, the drug market, the racial discrimination, a greater exposure to violence, as we just talked about, movies, games, and a greater economic inequality between the upper class, or I should say the multi-million billionaires, and then our poverty rate. I just saw the time, so I'm just going to try to hit the highlights. But we continue to talk about explaining homicide. Is it because of the structural explanations? Is it collective efficacy? The rates of violence decrease with neighborhoods when they have a stronger sense of community, when there's more involvement and more attachment. And we've talked about this, those communities that have more disorganization. And remember this, because when we get into our social structure, our social process theories, we're going to talk about social disorganization, and that's one of the reasons that the theorists believe that the crime rate is higher in those communities with a lot of transient and a lot of movement in and out with the lack of permanency. And now we're going to move to assault and battery. Assault is a threat or attempt to do bodily harm. Battery is the actual bodily harm to another. Assault's the most serious violent offense in the United States. Again, this is 2012, so let's look at 2015. And before I move to showing you the UCR, be careful with the way this is worded. The UCR reports roughly 1 million aggravated assaults each year, and that many more go unreported, but are those actually charged and convicted? And when we look at the UCR in 2014 and 15, you can see we don't have a assault and battery. It's going to separate them into aggravated assault. And so from 2014 to 15, it went up 4.1%, which is an increase from 2012 as well. Terrorism has become a lot more debated topic, a lot more researched topic since 9/11. There's 4 significant elements. It involves an act of violence intended to create fear. That is the purpose of terrorism. It targets active opponents. It also targets innocent victims. It doesn't matter who they kill, but it usually has a political purpose. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. If anybody can tell me what this means in class, you will be able to, that will count as your question for the class. So when we talk about this part in the class, mention that to me that you have that. Now we move to the definition of rape. And this is getting into an area that I'm very familiar with. As I have told you, I have worked with sex offenders. So the actual definition and what lies below that is can be very controversial. But the definition has recently been revised in order to be gender neutral, and it includes various forms of sexual activity. And this is one of those definitions that the relativity of law falls under, because rape has changed. The definition has changed so much over the years because of marital rape. 40 years ago, it was not a crime anywhere to rape your wife, so they had to change the definition. I wanted to show you something on the UCR, and if you look, there's two data sources that they've used. This, the legacy definition, this is the one that is the carnal knowledge of a woman being raped, and the total reported in 2014 was 7,000, 2015 another 7,500. But now, since they have revised the definition, look at the difference. Look at the rise of that definition from those. Now here is the information about how that definition changed. If you look here, it was forcible was removed from the offense name, and now the old definition that was 77,000 to 7,500 was the carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will. It's no longer a female, and it's also no longer forcibly. So now the definition is penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. And that's where it becomes very interesting in the law, is that concept of consent. And be more than happy to talk about this in class in greater detail. And the definition of rape includes those offenses of rape, sodomy, and sexual assault with an object. So the whole purpose of everything we're doing right now is explaining behavior, right? So when we look at how do we explain rape, we're going to talk about this a lot more in detail in class. I'm just going to quickly review these. There's the feminist theory, the sociobiological theory, the tension between the sexes, the feminist theory, which I'm not going to read, but quickly, it's just the change in the traditions of males have dominated every aspect of American life, historical life. And the social learning theory, that it's learned, aggressive behavior is learned. Is, if you see, if you grow up in a environment that the husband is abusive to the wife or abusive to their partner, and therefore they imitate that. I'm going to tell you about a young boy that I worked with years ago who was physically raped. He was raped and abused as a child, and he really did not know it was wrong. So when he turned around and raped himself, he compensated for that. He just didn't know he wasn't supposed to do that. It's the same thing with the victims. When you hear of girls and women that are victimized in their homes and they don't know any better, especially girls that are raped or assaulted by a male family member, and it happens and other people let it happen, they don't know that it's wrong, so they're not going to say anything. They think that every little girl's going through that. It's just, being in that environment, you just learn and think that it's okay. Sorry, I'm rattling on. Moving on. Family violence, child abuse. There are four forms of abuse that fall under this, and that's physical, sexual, emotional, and neglect. And of course, every state has a Department of Children's Services, Department of Human Services, and they all have their own definitions and how they handle it. That this also includes the cycle of violence that I was just talking about, that children who have been abused, they will turn into abusers. But I'm going to say something real quick on that. Just because a child is abused does not mean they will become an abuser, but a child that is abused is more likely to be, let me repeat. A child that abuses is more likely to have been abused than a child who's abused is not necessarily going to turn into an abuser. Wife battering also comes under family violence. This is where it was politically and sociological inappropriate to report that it was okay to beat your wife. We got to put her in her place. It's funny. Yeah, no. But, we have different views of, and it's shown in these songs, that, we love this stuff. Earl Had to Die, and Stand By Your Man. It's just the difference of, 50 years ago where you didn't talk about it. You didn't tell anybody, especially if you were being battered. That's just the way you handled it within your home. That's just something he needs to do. How many times have we heard this as excuses that, oh, he's just letting out steam? And we could go on and talk about this, but why do abused women stay with their abuser? Somebody in class is going to do domestic violence, so I won't say your name, but this is a great place to start. Is why do they abuse, but why does the woman stay in that relationship? And you'll find out that many times they not only do they just feel they deserve it, they don't feel they can get away. And we've looked at some data, some resources. The study in Minnesota, the domestic violence study, where those offenders who were arrested had a smaller risk of battering their wife. But also, too, it's been found that if the batterer leaves, they're more likely to be continued and even have a higher risk of being a victim of murder. This also includes violence towards siblings and the elderly, which you see as increasing. I'm not going to go into detail on these. Corporate, government, professional violence, white-collar crime, illegally disposing of chemicals, asbestos, those all fall under that corporate violence because it's leading to harm on another. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment down in Alabama that was done, that's an example of government violence. There was also some testing done on some soldiers many years ago. The professional violence of physicians that are preventable mistakes and necessary surgeries, the sexual assault of doctors on their patients, those all fall under professional violence. Organized crime, syndicates often engage in both legal and illegal. They do the legal to cover up the illegal so they can have something to do with their money. And it's characterized by the willingness to resort to violence to gain an advantage. Organized crime many times uses that violence to intimidate, to demand respect in order to attain large profits. Okay, promise I'm done. Sorry I went over. It's very important. We'll talk more about many of these areas in class.